Salvate omnes, and welcome to chapter 18. This will be the last full chapter that we learn this semester. Let's take a look at the topic, first and second conjugations, present system passive, ablative of agent. This is not a James Bond film. This is Latin grammar, and I'm your host, Dr. Thomas. What do we mean by passive? We're talking about the voice of a verb, hence passive voice, in contrast to what we have learned so far, namely active voice. What's the difference? Well, as the term suggests, if the verb is active, the subject performing the action is actively performing or doing the action. If it's passive, then the subject is passively doing the action or receiving the action. Fast forwarding a bit to some of the examples, if we take a look at active voice, we have admonet Caesarem, he warns, or he is warning Caesar. But if we put that same idea into the passive, Caesar, which is the direct object in the active, becomes the subject in the passive. Caesar ad monitor, Caesar is being warned. Another example, active, they were destroying the city. But if we put this same idea into the passive, the city becomes the subject, urbs delebatur. This is an important topic in Latin because Latin likes to use a lot of passive. At the same time, it's going to take a little bit of practice getting used to this, if for no other reason than the fact that English often prefers active, not passive. Although we do have some examples. Take, for example, the mechanic is fixing the car. If we put that same sentence into passive, the car is being fixed by the mechanic. How do we form the passive? Well, we substitute passive endings for active endings. So instead of our osmos tisnit, we use arrestur munmeninuntur. So we need to be able to identify these as our passive endings. Similarly, with the imperfect, we substitute our active endings for passive, arrestur munmeninuntur, still using our BA, but instead of bambe spat, bamos bate spant, we have barbaris batur, bamor bamini bantur. Future tense. Instead of bo be be boo, with our osmos tisnit, we still have a variety of bo be boo, although there are some spelling changes which are highlighted in bold and explained over here. And then we add our passive endings. Arrestur murmeni nuntor. As always, please read through the chapter, paying particular attention to the examples. Another aspect in this chapter related to passive is what's called the present passive infinitive, PPI, as we will call it. The present passive infinitive of the first and second conjugation verbs is formed by changing the final E of the active to I. So instead of having our infinitive, which goes all the way back to chapter 1, Laudare, we simply drop the E, add an I. Laudare, to be praised. Monere, to warn, we change it into the PPI. Moneri. Some further explanation of usage. Ablative of personal agent. This is something we've seen before. It's simply by or from. Here they have in italics the means by which. Let's take a look at some examples here. In fact, I would encourage you to pause the video or study these carefully in your book. What I like about these examples is it gives you both active and passive side by side so you can see the difference. So this covers a lot of terrain for the grammar in this chapter. Here we have the gods are warning Caesar, de Caesarem admonent. We take the same idea and put it in the passive. Caesar adis ademontor. I'm not going to go over all these examples. Another one that I think is interesting is the city was being destroyed by evil men. So there's our ablative of agent ab malis. Urbs ab malis viris delibator. We're going to take that same idea, which is an active voice, and put it into passive. Urbs flammis delibator. What is the general purpose of the passive? Well, it's a voice, so it just has a grammatical function, but you might think about it as focusing more on the process of the verb, whereas the subject, the person or thing in the active is still involved, but less important. So in this particular case, it's not so important that Caesar is being... that rather that the gods are warning Caesar, but rather the process of the warning itself by the gods. And so the gods who are doing the warning in the active sentence become passive in the passive because the focus is on the action of warning. All right, so conceptually it may take a couple of lessons to get used to this. One of the advantages, of course, of the internet, you can explore other explanations of active versus passive for you grammar nuts out there. Let's take a look at the vocab. As always, make sure you practice this using Quizlet or other online resources. Don't forget, Wheelox does have a companion website to help you with the pronunciation if necessary. We need to know these words because, one, they're in the chapter. Two, they will be on the final exam, perhaps. All right, let's take a look at the examples. Please, as always, do the self-tutorial exercises in the back as well. All right, let's take a look at this here. Here we have Possunt quia posse videntur by Virgil. They can because they seem to be able. Let me write this out. Virgil's actually, I think I mentioned before in a previous lesson, Virgil's actually fairly hard to translate. So even though he's a major writer, we don't have a lot of Virgil in the Wheelox. My guess is because of the difficulties in translating his Latin into standard English usage. But with that said, let's go ahead and write this out. So they can because they seem to be able. They can. Oops. Now, what does that even mean? Let's take a look at this one more time. So they can. So NT is they. Possunt is can. Once again, if you're not, this is an irregular verb. as always, you need to take the time and look up the vocabulary if you're not sure. So present active, indicative, third person plural, they can or they are able. Here it's kind of another note here as well. So you can either translate this as they are able or they can. Quia means because, and then here's our passive, arrestur. So if we pull this in our Whitaker's words, you can see it gives us the present passive, indicative, third person plural. And then the passive meaning is seem or appear. So if you wanted to write, you could as well, if I can, they can because they appear to be able. Now, what does that even mean? Well, in Virgil's text, there's a profound spiritual dimension to his language called piety. And like in Christian thought, going back to Greek thought, there's a difference between the mind and the body, soul and matter. If somebody looks happy, they probably are. If they look unhappy, they probably are. And so the relationship between the inner life and the outer life is one of the great mysteries of human existence. They seem to be related, and yet they're very different. And sometimes it's hard to say exactly what the relationship is between the inner and the outer, between the mind and the body. I think we all sense there's some relationship. One way to read Virgil is a study or a meditation on this relationship. All right, moving on to number duo, etiam fortes viris sobitis periculis saepe terrentur. What does that mean? You tell me. Etiam also fortes brave virimen sobitis suddenly periculis dangers saepe often terrentur are being terrified. But then we got to put it in coherent English, or at least comprehension. Tacitus, Roman historian of the imperial period. Brave men are also often terrified by sudden dangers. Let me write that out and then I will explain it. Brave men or courageous men are also I'm going to put the passive in here, and you'll see why English prefers active versus passive. If we go back to the example, our passive verb here is terrentur, which, because it has the nuntor, it's passive. And so are being terrified. Once again, please use Whitaker's words to confirm that. I'll do this for the last time in this lesson, but this is something you should be doing on your own. So here's our present passive indicative third person plural. So are being frightened, are being scared, are being terrified, are being deterred. It was probably the least attractive option. But you can see in English, this sounds a little bit wooden. And so notice the first time I did it, I actually took out the being because this sounds a little bit better English. It's just because English prefers active. Sometimes you'll see in grammar books, they will do something like this just to indicate it isn't passive, but we probably would leave it out in English translation. So that's a tricky component, and you have to make decisions, like in everything you do. Do you want to keep it literal passive, are often being terrified? Again, I would recommend that for learning a language. But if you were publishing it in sound English, you probably would have to leave it out because that would just seem too strange to native English speakers who would have no sense of the Latin. perhaps. So brave men are also often being terrified by sudden dangers. Let's talk about the rest of the grammar. So etiam is just an adverb also. Fortes is brave, and that is third declension nominative plural. As we've said many, many times, you have to learn the declensions of words, nouns and adjectives, and you can see the number 3 here tells us it's third declension. So that's why we have fortes, third declension nominative plural. And so learning the declension of nouns, not verbs, but nouns, is crucial for Latin. Once again, most nouns are the first 3 declensions. So if you can learn the first 3, it's going to be a game changer for your reading and comprehension of Latin. Viri is second declension. So second declension nominative plural is e. So fortes viri, which means brave men. Again, you'll have to look up these words on your own if you've forgotten or you don't know. But many of these words we have had in previous chapters. And then they give us this word here, subitis periculis. Now this is ablative of means. That is one of our grammar topics. It means how were, so here we have ablative of agent. But how were they, here we go, ablative of means right here. How were they scared, or how were they terrified? Well, in this particular instance, we read by sudden dangers. So if we look at second declension ablative plural, there's the is. So there's our subtiis periculis. And so by sudden dangers, ablative of means, and by is the common preposition that we use in that instance. Saipeab just means often. So in your own translation, you could perhaps move around your adverbs, saipe etiam, and then the rest of it reads as we just explained. Tres tua consilie sunt clare nobis tenere scientiae horum civium omnium by Cicero. This one also is going to require some sleuthing or looking up of vocabulary words. We need to be able to recognize this as a neuter noun. We have the verb in the plural, and then we have some dative. This one's going to be really tricky if you don't know the vocab, so you're going to have to take the time to look up the vocab. Once you do that, you'll have something like this. Your plans are clear to us. You hold knowledge of these civic things or civil things. But then comes, in one sense, the harder part. You need to smooth it out or be artistic with your interpretation so that it doesn't sound like it's from a dictionary. So your plans are clear to us. So let's go ahead and use that semicolon as a help in terms of organization. And we've seen before how, we do not have the context for this, but we've seen before how Cicero, in his critiques of Catiline and the conspiracy and treachery against Republican Rome in Cicero's view, so that could be the context for this perhaps. What's important for this one is concilia is a neuter noun coming from concilium, hence reinforcing the fact that you need to look up the vocab here. You can see this could mean a lot of things. I tend to interpret this as plans, but it does have a active or action component to it. But this one is a little bit tricky to translate. Only the context will help you with that. But then sunt is are, and then clare nobis. Clares, I believe, is one of the vocabulary words. Clear, bright, renowned, famous, illustrious. I think clear in this case makes the best sense. And again, these are all words in English that come from that. Nobis is the dative form of we, so to us. And then teneres, this is a word that also has potentially different, could mean you hold, keep, comprehend, possess. So maybe keep or comprehend. Let's see how that works. Your plans are clear to us. You comprehend or you keep knowledge of all these things. Although it's actually by knowledge, you comprehend. Yeah, so probably you comprehend by knowledge of all these civic things. So let's go ahead and write that out, and then we'll try to explain it. That last part is a little bit tricky, a little bit more abstract. But you keep, and then by knowledge. So we know it's by knowledge because we have the macron here. But then this last part is a little bit tricky. Of all of these civic things, civium also could present itself. Actually, in this case, it could be citizens. Let's see if that changes or helps a little bit. You comprehend by knowledge of all these. Let's see here. This one is not readily coming to me. Let's take a look at it one more time. Fellow citizens, Roman citizens, you hold, you comprehend, you keep by knowledge of all these civic things. Yeah, admittedly, this one is a little bit abstract, or maybe I need another cup of coffee. Probably do. It's early in the morning. You are being supported. Let's try that. That might actually work. Let me see if that works, and I'll try to explain what my revision is. Your plans are clear to us. You are being supported by knowledge of all of these citizens. That seems to make a little bit more sense. Cicero, as you may recall, is a representative of Roman republicanism. And so this idea is that if your plans are clear to us, then this clarity isn't the result of a single person, but rather is something that is objective or republican, literally a thing of the people. And so this clarity is something that comes from this knowledge that other citizens possess, who possess reason and virtue according to Cicero's anthropology or philosophy of man. So once again, as with translation, the main goal in one sense is not translation but comprehension. I think the basic idea is fairly clear, is that it's knowledge of civic life in a moral, rational sense, according to Cicero, is what helps us bring about moral judgments. All right, moving on to number 4. Malum est concilium quod mutare non potest. This one's a little bit easier. So here we have concilium again, but this time as a singular subject. A plan is bad that is not able to be changed. All right, this one definitely is a little bit easier. All right, so this one we have the perfect passive infinitive, mutare, which we had earlier, the PPI. And so it ends in I, mutare, mutation, to change, which is fairly straightforward. The A plan, I'll probably say A plan, concilium, is as bad, that, or you could say which too, is not able, non potest, and then mutare, to be changed. Being flexible is important. Number 5, fas est, and they tell us this means it is right. And then we have another PPI. Docere means to be taught or to be instructed. So it is right to be taught by the enemy. Potentially from the enemy, but I think by the enemy that's what I would go with. So it is right. As noted, please take the time to look up these words, but they give us fas est. Docere is the perfect passive infinitive. We'll see what this looks like. So here we have the present passive, or not, present passive infinitive, to be taught, to be shown, to be pointed out. Notice we're using the be because it's passive. I think to be taught makes the most sense based on the context, and that's a good example of the perfect passive infinitive by Ovid. Number 6, eo tempore erant circensis ludi quo genere levi spectaculi numquam tenior, by Pliny. Great observer of life, as a lot of our Roman writers were. Eo tempore means at that time. So we can go ahead and write out that adverb time expression. At that time, could be during that time, might work as well. Notice that they're both in the ablative. This is second declension ablative singular. This is third declension ablative singular. So eo tempore, ablative time expression. Ablative, as we mentioned in the first video lesson, going back to Latin 101, probably the trickiest case in Latin. Errant means were. So eram, res erant, eramus, erates erant. And then circensis ludis, they give us that contest in the circus. So if it's in italics, that's our translation. Literally circus games. So at that time, there were contests in the circus. And then this last part is a little bit trickier. We're going to follow it. Here they say quo genere, where we get genus, like genus and species in biology and science. So they say by which kind. Let's go ahead and write that out just because they give it to us. And so by, but I think a lot of us, certainly as native English speakers, we probably don't use this phrase very often. By which kind, it seems very abstract, overly formal, but that's what it means according to this, so we'll go with it. And then here's where it gets a little bit tricky. Levi spectaculi numquam tenior. So Levi spectaculi is literally trivial games, like with levity. So this could be light, thin, trivial, trifling, slight, gentle, fickle, capricious, nimble, smooth, slippery. So it's an adjective. polished, plain, free from coarse. And so you can see this one's a little bit tricky because we have a lot of options. I'm going to go with trivial for my translation. So by which kind, I am never being held by trivial spectacles. Now, as you can see, this is almost unclear in English, but this is what it literally means. The basic idea is pretty clear, is that at that time there were contests in the circus that I found trivial to watch. In other words, they were bred in circuses, entertainment. But the Latin grammar makes it a little bit trickier to translate. Again, if you were translating this and publishing it, you would do something like that. At that time, there were contests in the circus that I found trivial to watch. I mean, you could even write that as your translation, but then that begs the question, how did you know that without simply just adopting my suggestion? Because quo genere does mean by which kind, or a kind by which. So if we did follow this suggestion, a kind of trivial, so I guess you could put it, but then you have to put of, a kind of trivial spectacle by which I was never interested, or a kind of trivial spectacle in which I was never interested. So this one is a little bit tricky because it requires changing, or not changing, but interpreting the Latin in ways that is going to encourage us to be creative with our English. I'm going to keep it like this because I try to keep my translations literal and without spending 10-15 minutes on it to come up with something more creative, which is always possible. I think I'm just going to move on to number 7. Actually, one more point on this one, that just for clarification, since it is our passive. You can see this is the challenge too, is that how do we translate tenior, present passive indicative, first person singular? I hold, I am being held, I am keeping, I am comprehending, I am possessing, I am mastering, I am preserving. And so a lot of these, don't really. So I went with hold. Now it is passive, so I said being held. But you can see this presents certain challenges for the translation. All right, let's move on to number 7 here. And this one is a little bit longer, so we're probably going to have to spend some time looking up some words on this one. It's by Cicero. So when you take the time to look up words in the back of the book, a dictionary or Whitaker's words, you're going to have something like this. This is now life my. I receive and greet good men who to me come. Then either I write or I read. After these or this, all time to body is being given. So the last part has our passive datur, which means being given. You may recall this was one of the first verbs you learned way back in chapter 1. And so we just go back to our basic dodari dediratum, this is present active indicative. Now, if we take a look at the passive voice, we can see that datur is passive. For you grammar nerds out there, again, this is something that is a little bit tricky to do in this online format. But there are, of course, if I look at this right here, and I'll just do that, and here's our Latin. Let's see, do they give us that here? No. Oh, let's see here. There we go. That's what I was looking for. Or it's been a while since I've used this site. Okay, there we go. So they have more pop-ups. So this actually is the verb I give. So if you go back to chapter 1, do, I give, this is the full panorama of the verb conjugation and the verb voice and the verb mood. You can see it's much more formidable in one sense than the Latin declension, because you need to know this for all of the verbs. So you need to know the indicative, but you also need to know the subjunctive, which we haven't had yet. Here's active, here's passive. And then you need to know all the different tenses, present, imperfect, future, and of course, imperative. And it's kind of hard even on this. You can see it's hard on this screen in this format to do justice to this. But for our purposes, take a look at do, das, dat, damos, datis, dant. So I give, you give, he gives, we give, you all give, they give. But then here's our passive. Dor, daris, datur, damor, damini, dantur. So there's our aris, tuor, murmuri, nuntur. You can see in the example that we have in the Cicero sentence, datur is the passive form of gives in the third person singular. And so this is sort of the big picture of ultimately where you're trying to go with this. And you can imagine this takes many, many years of hard study in order to be able to master this. We just have to be able to learn one word and note that it means is being given, because it is present tense and it is passive indicative. We haven't had subjunctive yet, so you can take out the right columns. But for you grammar nerds out there, yay grammar, this is the big picture. If you feel like you're not being challenged enough, you can start writing out your verb tables in a notebook. All right, let's take a look at the sentence then. So there's our datur that we were just talking about. And in this case, after all these things, all my time is being given to my body, in other words, to physical exercise. But notice it's the mind first, and then the body afterwards. This is now my life. In fact, we can keep that rather literal. This now is my life. What's the context of this? He's probably in exile, if you will, because of the political tumult in Rome at this time. So he's retreated to his country villa, perhaps. That would be my guess. No longer actively engaged in public life because it's too violent, and so he has retreated to the countryside. This is now my life. I receive. So it literally, I admit. I receive and greet good men, people who come to visit him. So, and greet, saluto, salute, good men, bonos viros. Notice that is second declension accusative plural. So that is the direct object. Viros bonos, bonos viros. Who, there's our relative pronoun from chapter 17, who come to me. Literally, so who come to me. It's fairly straightforward. Who, in other words, who come to visit me. Then, out means either or. Then either I write or read. So diende means then. Diende, then, either I write or read. And the last part is a little bit trickier to translate. After this, so post hike, omne tempus means all my time is being given to my body. So here's a good example, once again, where we have it in the passive, but it just sounds a little bit weird. In English, you might say, after this, I spend time exercising my body. Notice in that example, I spend time. That's what the active is. The active emphasizes the subject. But here, the emphasis is on the time being given to the exercise. And so clearly Cicero is the one doing it. But we don't have a named subject in the sentence. It's sort of implied, and that's the whole point of the passive. Now, you may be asking yourself, what's the point of this? Well, if you're focusing on scientific processes, whether evolution or psychoanalysis, you can see how the passive is very helpful to describe certain processes of evolution and psychic traumas, which seem to supersede the understanding of the individual or the ego. And I will tell you that a lot of great works in science, I just mentioned two, namely Darwin and Freud, use passive voice a lot to construct their narrative and interpretations of life as processes. And so that is sort of the one advantage, perhaps, of passive versus active. But going back to our textbook, after this, all my time is being given to the body. I'm going to put in my, even though it doesn't say my. All my time. So datur, to the body. Notice to the body is third declension, actually a second declension, dative singular, corpori, because corpus is the nominative us ending. No, it is third declension, excuse me. Yeah, so I was right. Corpori ending in I. Corpor, corporis are the nouns. All right, number 8. Acta nihil igitur mors est quoniam naturae animi habitur. Therefore, death is nothing, since the nature of the soul is having mortality. So, is having, there's our aorist tuum nuntur. So, therefore, death is nothing, since it is since the nature of the soul is mortal. Notice that would be the active translation. Let me go ahead and write this out, and then we'll explain it. Death, therefore, is nothing. Mors, death, therefore, igitur, is nothing. Since, quoniam, the nature of the soul is having mortality. Again, that's what it literally means. I put it in more idiomatic English. Death, therefore, is nothing, since the nature of the soul is mortality. Lucretius, of course, he's an interesting writer. The founding fathers actually read Lucretius. We shouldn't be afraid of death, because death supersedes our knowledge. So to be afraid of something we don't know or can never know is irrational. And besides, the one thing that we do know is that we're going to die. So to be afraid of certainty also is a form of irrationality and human madness. The founders didn't put it quite in those terms, but if you read their writings, that's sort of what they're saying. Number 9, amor miscere cum timere non potest. Love to be mixed with fear is not possible. Publilius Syrus, highly recommend him. So love is not able to be mixed with fear. Love, amor, is not able, non potest, to be mixed, there's our PPI, cum timere, with fear, timid. Notice that cum is followed by the ablative, third declension, ablative singular is E. That one's fairly straightforward. And then the last one, we tend to do about 10 here. Numquam enam temeritis cum sapientior commiscitur. For rashness is never to be mixed with wisdom. Let's go over this one here. Again, as always, please look up the word. You'll have something like this. Never. For. Rashness. Again, we'll follow that right here. With. Wisdom. Mixed. Used for intensification. So this is miscitur. For rashness is, we have to put a verb in there, is never, in fact, I'd probably say is never mixed, because otherwise I'm making it a PPI. So let me go ahead and change that. Is never, for rashness is never mixed, commiscitur, with wisdom, sapientiae. Notice that that is first declension ablative singular, because sapientia, sapientiae. Again, as always, if we're not sure, we look this up and we can see that it is first declension as a noun. All right, we're going to stop for today. Our next lesson will be on death and metamorphosis, but I will do that for next week, and we're going to call it a day here. It's a beautiful Sunday. I'm going to do a little bit of reading, some house duties, and then I may find myself testing my own sanity on the golf course. I do not recommend taking up golf unless you want to experience the limits of your own madness. Valete.